The dust of the ancestral estate, Blackwood Acres, settled over the bankruptcy papers like a shroud. For 20 years their life had been built on the solid bedrock of tradition and wealth. Now the foundation was dust. She watched him across the mahogany table, not with pity but with calculated disdain. The farmer, once the respected pillar of his county, was now just a failure in worn denim. A sleek black sedan waited beyond the sprawling porch, its engine humming a promise of a different, glittering future. She slipped the diamond ring from her finger, a family heirloom symbolizing generations of loyalty, and let it clatter onto the wood. Her departure was swift, brutal, and entirely public, a transaction completed in the cold light of an autumn morning. What she didn't see, behind the intense blue eyes of the man she had just discarded, was the absolute absence of surprise. The financial ruin was real to the world, but to him it was merely the first necessary move on a far grander and infinitely more dangerous chessboard. He watched the tail lights disappear, tasting the humiliation, knowing that her betrayal was the precise evidence he needed to execute his final devastating strategy. She believed she had escaped a sinking ship. He knew she had just walked straight into the cage he built for her. The intense blue eyes of Garrett Hawthorne, 46, were fixed on the empty space where the ancestral portrait of his great-grandfather should have hung. It was gone, along with several other non-essential, yet deeply symbolic pieces of the Blackwood Acres legacy. The estate, expansive and fertile, now felt hollowed out, not by the physical removal of objects, but by the sudden, chilling absence of shared history. Autumn 2024 had delivered not just crisp air and falling leaves, but a financial and marital catastrophe that had become the primary subject of every social conversation in the Tri-County area. Garrett stood amidst the wreckage, a man weathering a storm he himself had conjured. He walked slowly through the aging farmhouse, his steps deliberate on the worn oak floors. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling the fields. Vivian Caldwell. Sterling, 42, had ensured her departure was theatrical, a clear signal to the world that she was severing all ties with failure. She had not simply left. She had executed a public withdrawal of affection, loyalty, and commitment, validating every rumor of Garrett's irreversible financial ruin, the fictitious bankruptcy declaration that had rocked the community. Garrett paused by the fireplace, running his fingers over the mantelpiece where a silver-framed photograph had rested for years, a younger Vivian, radiant on their wedding day, juxtaposed against the rugged backdrop of Blackwood Acres. He picked up the frame now, noting the faint dust outline where it had been moved. He didn't smash it. He simply placed it face down. Emotion was a liability, and Garrett was operating with the cold precision of a surgeon. The humiliation was a raw, burning sensation in his gut, but it was essential. It was the lubricant that allowed the gears of his true plan to turn unnoticed. The world saw a broken man, defeated by the complexity of modern finance. They saw the farmer whose weathered hands, accustomed to the tactile reality of soil and harvest, were incapable of grasping the abstract brutality of the stock market. This perception was Garrett's greatest asset. He moved toward his small private study, a room insulated from the main house. The desk was cluttered with what appeared to be final notices, foreclosure warnings, and stacks of worthless commodity reports, all carefully curated props. Beneath the veneer of fiscal chaos, however, lay the true nerve center of his operation. Garrett pulled a specific volume from the bookshelf, a thick leather-bound copy of agricultural law, which triggered a silent mechanism, revealing a highly secured biometric interface. This was where the Caldwell fortune truly resided. The screen flickered to life, displaying complex flowcharts and encrypted data streams. The Davenport Trust Office, discreetly located in a quiet financial district miles away, was the physical anchor of his concealed wealth. Through a series of brilliant, almost untraceable shell corporations and offshore holdings, Garrett had executed a strategic retreat. He had lost the money. He had simply made it invisible to everyone except himself and his single trusted financial executor, a man who believed implicitly in Garrett's long-term vision. The Sterling Thorne merger documents were already being drafted, though not in the way Harrison Thorne, 58, imagined. Thorne, arrogant and transactional, had swooped in, eager to acquire the seemingly distressed Caldwell assets at a fraction of their worth, believing he was netting a bargain and a beautiful trophy wife in one swift move. Thorne saw Blackwood Acres as a stepping stone, a piece of old money legitimacy to be absorbed into his sleek predatory empire centered in the Pinnacle Tower. Garrett accessed a secure feed. The screen shifted, displaying high-resolution images taken moments ago. Vivian, draped in silk that shimmered like liquid platinum, was exiting a private jet on the tarmac of a major city airport, her arm linked possessively through Harrison Thorne's. Thorne's silver hair gleamed under the artificial lights, his expensive suit a testament to his untouchable wealth. Vivian's face, usually taut with the stress of maintaining social appearances in the county, was relaxed, almost smug. She was already inhabiting the role of the corporate magnate's wife, embracing the opulence she had always coveted. Garrett zoomed in on Vivian's hand. No sign of the simple gold band she had worn for 2 decades. The Caldwell family signet ring, which she had tossed onto the mahogany table before leaving, was still sitting on Garrett's desk, a cold, heavy reproach. "You traded 20 years for a few weeks of borrowed shine, Vivian," Garrett murmured. His voice low, devoid of self-pity, filled instead with a calculated determination. The betrayal was not just emotional. It was a profound violation of the ethical code that governed Garrett's life. He had spent years building Blackwood Acres, not just for wealth, but for legacy, for stability. Vivian had viewed that stability as stagnation, a ceiling on her ambition. Her immediate public pivot to Thorne was the ultimate confirmation of her mercenary nature. Garrett's plan was fueled by this confirmation. The financial collapse was the test. Vivian's abandonment was the passing grade for the trap. Had she stayed, had she shown even a shred of loyalty or willingness to face perceived adversity, the hidden fortune would have been revealed, and their marriage would have continued, albeit, perhaps, scarred. But her swift exit proved everything Garrett had suspected. During the final, strained years of their marriage, she valued status over substance and wealth over commitment. He opened the anonymous digital ledger. This was the digital archive of her betrayal, a meticulously compiled record spanning the last 2 years, encrypted communications, travel logs, expense reports detailing gifts from Thorne, and photographic evidence of their clandestine meetings. Garrett hadn't hired a private investigator. He had used his own considerable and often underestimated technological resources, leveraging his farm's advanced satellite mapping and data analysis systems for a far more personal purpose. The ledger was designed not merely for proof in a divorce court, but for a devastating public media release. The immediate next phase required absolute silence and extreme risk. While the world believed Garrett was liquidating his last few assets, preparing to disappear into obscurity, he was preparing the silent acquisition of Thorne's competitor firm. This competitor, known as Meridian Global, was a sprawling, decentralized conglomerate that Thorne had long viewed as a minor irritant, too fragmented to pose a real threat. But Garrett saw its potential. Using his concealed capital, he was buying up shares through a dozen different holding companies, slowly, quietly, avoiding the threshold that would trigger SEC disclosure and alert Thorne to the hostile takeover. The task was exhausting, requiring immense concentration and emotional detachment. Garrett often worked through the night, the only light in the sprawling farmhouse emanating from his hidden study. He slept only a few hours, haunted not by regret, but by the strategic challenge ahead. He had to maintain the facade of failure while simultaneously managing a multi-billion-dollar corporate maneuver. One evening, a neighbor, old Mr. Hemmings, drove by Blackwood Acres and stopped, leaning out of his dusty pickup truck. "Garrett, you holding up, son?" Hemmings called out, his voice thick with genuine, if patronizing, sympathy. Garrett, who was intentionally wearing a faded shirt and appeared to be struggling to fix a loose fence post, forced a weary smile. "Trying to, Frank. It's been rough. Hardest thing is knowing I let the legacy down." Hemmings shook his head sadly. "That woman, she didn't deserve you, Garrett. Trading the land for city lights. Some people, they just chase the glitter." Garrett nodded, letting the comment sink in. "She made her choice, Frank. I just have to live with the consequences." This interaction was crucial. Garrett needed the narrative of the wronged, stoic victim to cement itself in the public consciousness. He needed the community to view Vivian's actions as the ultimate moral failure, thereby granting him the moral high ground when the truth finally detonated. He returned to the study. The image of Vivian and Harrison Thorne still burned into his mind. Harrison Thorne represented everything Garrett despised: the fleeting, ephemeral nature of new money, the lack of rootedness, the belief that everything, including human loyalty, was merely a transaction. Thorne saw Vivian as an accessory. Vivian saw Thorne as security. Both were fundamentally shallow, and Garrett was preparing to expose that shallowness to the brutal light of public scrutiny. The acquisition of Meridian Global was progressing faster than anticipated. Garrett's team, a small group of highly specialized, discreet financial analysts who believed they were working for a shadowy, anonymous investor, were executing the buyouts with surgical precision. They were consolidating fragmented holdings, streamlining operations, and preparing the firm to be the perfect weapon. Garrett realized that the true genius of his plan lay in its simplicity. He was using Harrison Thorne's own greed against him. Thorne was so focused on the supposed distressed assets of Blackwood Acres, the land, the commodity futures, that he entirely missed the far larger strategic move happening in the corporate sphere. Thorne was looking down while Garrett was maneuvering above. The transition for Vivian was seamless yet jarring. She had moved from the quiet, traditional formality of Blackwood Acres to the unrelenting, glittering chaos of the Pinnacle Tower penthouse. Her days were now a whirlwind of high-end shopping, charity galas, and endless discussions about interior design. She was constantly striving for perfection, trying to fit into the polished, ruthless world of Harrison Thorne. One afternoon, sitting in the vast, minimalist living room of the penthouse, overlooking the sprawling city, Vivian received a call from an old friend from the county, expressing condolences for her terrible loss and asking about Garrett. Vivian sighed, rolling her eyes to Harrison, who was reading financial reports nearby. Oh, darling, it was inevitable. Garrett was simply too provincial. He couldn't keep up. Honestly, the bankruptcy was a blessing in disguise. I couldn't face a life of scarcity. Harrison chuckled, not looking up from his tablet. Smart girl. Loyalty is only valuable when the asset is appreciating, Vivian. Garrett was depreciating rapidly. Vivian smiled, basking in Thorne's approval. She truly believed she had made the smartest, most pragmatic choice of her life. The brief, sharp pang of guilt she occasionally felt about the abruptness of her departure was quickly smothered by the sheer weight of opulence surrounding her. She had secured her financial stability, and that was all that mattered. She had no idea that her every word, her every move was being logged, analyzed, and filed away by the man she had dismissed as a failure. Back at Blackwood Acres, the exterior neglect was deepening, the porch paint was peeling, and the fields were intentionally left fallow in certain visible sections, reinforcing the image of a farm abandoned by its master. But inside the hidden study, Garrett was finalizing the structure of Meridian Global. It was winter 2024 now. The cold had settled in, matching the chill in Garrett's demeanor. He had spent the last 2 months consolidating power, and the moment of maximum leverage was rapidly approaching. He had acquired 49% of Meridian Global, just shy of the controlling interest that would mandate a public filing. The final 2% would be acquired in a single massive transaction designed to coincide with the most vulnerable point in Thorne Industries' annual cycle. Garrett looked at the screen, which now displayed a detailed cross-referenced timeline. June 2026, the date of the final devastating move. A year and a half of silent observation, meticulous planning, and profound emotional endurance separated him from the moment of truth. He picked up the Caldwell family signet ring again. He didn't feel rage anymore, only a profound, cold clarity. This wasn't about winning back Vivian. It was about demonstrating that character, loyalty, and true substance always outweighed superficial wealth. It was about proving that the quiet man, the farmer with the weathered hands, was playing a far deeper game than the ruthless corporate titan could ever comprehend. He closed the digital ledger, the photographic evidence of Vivian's infidelity and self-serving choices secured. The trap was set. Now all Garrett had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it, ensuring that the revelation of his hidden fortune would not just reclaim his standing, but utterly dismantle the glittering new life Vivian had so eagerly embraced. The silence of Blackwood Acres was not the silence of defeat, it was the quiet before the explosion. Garrett Hawthorne was not bankrupt, he was simply hidden, preparing for the most calculated resurgence the financial world had ever witnessed. He was ready to watch the consequences of greed unfold. The silence at Blackwood Acres was a carefully cultivated lie, a profound quietude that masked the humming intensity of a financial war room operating miles away. Garrett Hawthorne, 46, had shed the skin of the failing farmer, replacing it with the sharp, almost clinical focus of a man operating on pure, distilled strategy. He rarely visited the ancestral farmhouse now, preferring the sterile, unmarked efficiency of the Davenport Trust Office, a discreet financial holding location nestled in the quiet heart of the city's oldest banking district. It was early spring 2025. Outside, the city was awakening from the long winter, but inside the highly secured office, Garrett was submerged in the granular details of Harrison Thorne's 58 empire. The office itself was nondescript, furnished only with necessary high-tech equipment, soundproofing, and a single large screen displaying complex color-coded financial charts. This was not a place of comfort or legacy, it was a forge where vengeance was being hammered into cold, hard capital. Garrett's hands, still weathered from years of working the fertile land, now moved with precision across a bespoke keyboard, navigating through layers of encrypted data. The fictitious bankruptcy declaration, filed 6 months prior, had been a masterstroke of misdirection, a public spectacle designed to draw out the vultures. While the world mourned the demise of Blackwood Acres, Garrett had systematically funneled the true assets, not into offshore accounts, but into the structure of Meridian Global, a direct aggressive competitor to Thorne Industries. The psychological warfare was the most demanding element. Maintaining the persona of the broken, humiliated man required absolute isolation. He allowed select, carefully chosen former colleagues to see him in brief, staged moments of despair, ensuring the narrative of his ruin was robustly cemented in the social consciousness. Each pitying glance, each murmured condolence was a brick laid in the foundation of his ultimate trap. He paused, leaning back in his chair, the intense blue eyes reflecting the cool light of the monitor. He was analyzing a recent acquisition by Thorne Industries, a mid-sized tech firm Harrison had overpaid for, desperate to maintain his aggressive growth trajectory. Harrison Thorne, for all his arrogance, was predictable. He saw business as a zero-sum game, relying on brute force and transactional superiority. He lacked the long-term vision and, crucially, the patience that Garrett possessed. The Caldwell family signet ring lay on the steel desk beside the keyboard, a constant tangible reminder of the loyalty that had been so casually discarded. Vivian Caldwell Sterling, 42, was now fully integrated into Harrison's opulent, superficial world. Garrett received weekly, highly detailed reports, not from a private investigator, but from a specialized social media aggregation service he had contracted under a shell corporation. These reports documented every lavish dinner, every expensive trip, every self-congratulatory post painting a picture of a woman thriving in her perceived liberation. Vivian's transformation was startling, if entirely predictable. Her platinum blonde hair was always perfect, her clothes impeccably dressed, every feature sharp and polished, reflecting an obsession with social status. She was not just enjoying wealth, she was performing it. One evening, Garrett watched a video clip from a recent charity gala. Vivian, draped in diamonds that screamed borrowed money, was laughing loudly, her arm linked tightly with Harrison Thorne's. Harrison, smooth and commanding, was giving a brief, arrogant interview about the future of his firm. Thorne Industries doesn't just adapt, Harrison drawled into the microphone, his silver hair catching the light. We dictate the market. We absorb the weak and reward the decisive. Vivian nodded vigorously beside him, her face radiating the smug satisfaction of having chosen the decisive path. Garrett felt no pain watching this, only a deepening resolve. Her greed was his greatest asset. She had not just left a husband, she had abandoned a legacy a history and a depth of character she was incapable of understanding. The price of her choice would be the complete and total loss of the very status she was now so desperately clinging to. As winter 2025 bled into spring, Garrett finalized the acquisition of the critical 2% of Meridian Global. This move was made through a complex series of blind trusts, ensuring that the controlling interest was officially held by a seemingly unrelated entity. Garrett was now technically the silent puppet master of Thorn Industries' primary rival. The anonymous digital ledger, the secure encrypted file, was now complete. It contained not just the meticulous timeline of the asset transfer, proving that the bankruptcy was a deliberate, complex shell game, but also photographic evidence of Vivian's infidelity, captured during her early clandestine meetings with Harrison before the bankruptcy was even declared. This proved premeditation, painting her betrayal not as a reaction to failure, but as a calculated, mercenary act. Garrett's strategy was layered. The financial strike would be swift and overwhelming, designed to collapse Thorn Industries' stock value and trigger a cascade of debt calls. The public humiliation, however, would be the true masterpiece. The ledger was programmed for a timed release to 3 major financial news outlets and several high-profile social media influencers, ensuring maximum, instantaneous exposure. Meanwhile, in the Pinnacle Tower, Vivian and Harrison were enjoying what they believed was the untouchable peak of their success. Their luxury penthouse offered a panoramic view of the city, a constant reminder to Vivian that she had escaped the dust and decay of Blackwood Acres. "Harrison, darling, did you see the papers today? That pathetic article about the Caldwell estate auction?" Vivian asked, sipping champagne on their balcony one humid evening in early 2026. Harrison grunted, reviewing stock reports. A footnote. "Irrelevant. Why dwell on the past, Vivian? You are a sterling now." Vivian smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She was constantly battling a creeping anxiety, a fear that her past might somehow taint her present. Harrison was demanding, transactional. He valued her as an accessory, a symbol of his power and good taste, not as a partner. Their life was a series of performances, and the pressure to maintain perfection was exhausting. "I just hope Garrett doesn't try anything desperate," she mused, adjusting the massive diamond engagement ring Harrison had given her. Harrison finally looked up, his expression cold. "Desperate? The man is ruined. He's selling off antique farm equipment to pay lawyers. He has nothing left to threaten us with. The only thing he has left is his pride, and I crushed that 6 months ago when I took his wife and his land." He laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. This arrogance, this absolute certainty of his own invincibility, was exactly what Garrett had banked on. Harrison never looked down. He assumed the vanquished stayed down. The date approached, June 2026. Garrett was back at Blackwood Acres for the final few weeks, intentionally making himself visible. The farmhouse looked even more dilapidated now. He wore simple, worn clothes, projecting an image of weary acceptance. He allowed the local community to witness his apparent decline, reinforcing the public narrative that he was utterly defeated. The final meeting at the Davenport Trust office was brief and clinical. Garrett reviewed the final merger documents, the Sterling Thorn merger documents, which Harrison had been pushing aggressively. Harrison needed this merger to cover a massive, undisclosed debt hole in Thorn Industries, a hole Garrett had helped widen through strategic market maneuvers over the past year. Garrett's plan was timed to perfection. Harrison would announce the merger, driving the stock up momentarily, right before the debt call was triggered by Meridian Global acting under Garrett's direction. The resulting panic would cause the stock to plummet, collapsing the merger and exposing Thorn Industries' insolvency. The climax arrived on a clear, bright Tuesday morning in June 2026. Vivian was at a high-profile luncheon surrounded by the elite of the city, basking in the glow of her imminent elevation to the status of Mrs. Harrison Thorn. She was regaling a table of women with anecdotes about their upcoming European cruise, emphasizing the sheer impossibility of her ever returning to her former, meager life. Suddenly, a woman at the table gasped, dropping her phone. "My God, Thorn Industries. The stock is in free fall." Vivian frowned, annoyed by the interruption. Nonsense, darling. Harrison just announced the merger. It's impossible. But the murmurs spread like wildfire. Everyone was frantically checking their phones. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory opulence to sheer panicked dread. Vivian pulled out her own phone, her perfectly manicured hand trembling as she navigated to the financial news sites. The headline screamed across the screen, "Thorn Industries collapses amidst unprecedented debt call. Meridian Global exposes fraudulent accounting." Her breath caught. That wasn't the worst of it. Below the main headline, a smaller, more insidious title flashed, "The Caldwell Resurgence. Bankrupt farmer revealed as Meridian Global's silent architect." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. It was a physical blow. The room spun, the glittering chandeliers blurring into mocking halos. Garrett? Bankrupt? Silent architect? She frantically searched for more details, her fingers slipping on the glass screen. Then she found the link to the anonymous digital ledger, now viral across every platform. The first image was a high-resolution scan of the Caldwell family signet ring, the very ring she had tossed aside in her haste to leave. The caption was brutally simple, "The cost of loyalty." The next pages detailed the asset transfer, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Blackwood Acres had never been lost. It had merely been moved, shielded, and leveraged. The bankruptcy had been a meticulously planned illusion, a strategic maneuver designed to test the loyalty of those closest to him. Then came the final, devastating blow, the photographic evidence, a series of time-stamped, crystal-clear photographs showing Vivian and Harrison meeting secretly in hotel lobbies and private clubs, months before the bankruptcy declaration. The timeline was undeniable. Her abandonment was not a reaction to failure, but a calculated, premeditated betrayal rooted in pure financial opportunism. Vivian dropped her phone. The sound of it hitting the marble floor was swallowed by the collective gasps and whispers of the room. The women who had been fawning over her moments ago now looked at her with a mixture of pity and cruel satisfaction. She was exposed, not just as a woman who left her husband, but as a shallow mercenary who had been outmaneuvered by the very man she had scorned. At the Pinnacle Tower, Harrison Thorne was already being escorted out of his office by federal agents, his commanding presence reduced to sputtering rage. He understood with terrifying clarity that the farmer he dismissed as provincial had played a game of chess while Harrison was playing checkers. Back at Blackwood Acres, Garrett Hawthorne stood on the porch, the peeling paint and fallow fields still presenting the image of ruin to the casual observer. But he was no longer the broken man. He was impeccably dressed in his tailored, simple attire, his intense blue eyes clear and unwavering. He had just received the final confirmation. Thorn Industries was in receivership. Harrison Thorne was facing multiple charges of financial fraud, and the public narrative had flipped entirely. Garrett was not a victim. He was a strategic genius, a man who had used his apparent ruin as the ultimate high-stakes trap. He didn't feel triumph, not exactly, only a cold, profound satisfaction. He had not sought revenge. He had sought justice, delivered with surgical precision. He had recovered his standing, his assets, and his legacy, all while revealing the mercenary nature of his former wife. Garrett picked up a discarded copy of the financial paper, looking at Vivian's horrified face, captured mid-gasp at the luncheon. She had chosen material gain over loyalty and commitment, believing she was securing her future. Instead, she had walked directly into the meticulously constructed ruins of her own making. The silence of Blackwood Acres had finally broken, replaced by the deafening roar of consequence. The game was over, and the quiet man had won everything. The collective silence in the opulent ballroom, following the explosion of the anonymous digital ledger, was heavier than any noise. Vivian, still frozen beside the overturned champagne flute, felt the weight of every gaze shift from admiration to predatory scorn. Her designer gown suddenly felt like a heavy shroud, trapping her in the suffocating reality of her exposure. She managed to push herself away from the table, not walking but stumbling. The platinum blonde hair that had always been her crown, now feeling brittle and cheap. The whispers followed her like a tide of venomous insects, mercenary, betrayed, ruined. She fled the luncheon, ignoring the frantic calls of the few remaining sycophants who were desperately trying to gauge if she was salvageable. The drive back to the Pinnacle Tower was a blur of panicked denial. She kept repeating the same phrase to herself, a desperate mantra against the encroaching truth. It's a lie. It has to be a fabrication. But the images, the undeniable timeline, the precise financial records detailing the transfer, not the loss of Blackwood Acres capital, burned behind her eyes. Garrett had not simply gone bankrupt. He had staged his own funeral, and she had gleefully danced on the grave, never realizing the ground was a trapdoor. When she reached the penthouse, the silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the buzzing humiliation she had just escaped. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows, usually a source of smug satisfaction, now felt like a mocking panorama of the city that was currently laughing at her. She threw her purse onto the white leather sofa and grabbed her phone, which was still ringing incessantly with blocked numbers and media alerts. She needed Harrison. She needed his arrogant, commanding presence to tell her this was manageable, that his legal team could bury the story, that his wealth was untouchable. She dialed his private line. Busy. She tried his office line at Thorn Industries. A cold, automated message informed her the number was temporarily out of service due to unforeseen circumstances. The pit in her stomach deepened. Unforeseen circumstances. That was the polite corporate euphemism for federal investigation and seizure. Vivian paced the vast living space, her expensive heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the imported marble. She went to the secure safe, pulling out the portfolio of investment documents Harrison had given her, the promises of shared future wealth. The documents were glossy, impressive, bearing the seal of Thorn Industries. But now, with the chilling context of the digital ledger, she saw them not as assets, but as liabilities tethered to a sinking ship. She realized with a sickening jolt that Garrett hadn't just exposed her. He had used her and Harrison's relationship as the final public nail in Harrison's corporate coffin, ensuring the maximum possible humiliation for both of them. Her eyes fell upon the empty space on her vanity, where the Caldwell family signet ring had rested for a brief, scornful moment before she had tossed it away in the farmhouse dust. A sudden, irrational need seized her. She needed that ring. Not for its monetary value, but as a tangible link to a past she had discarded, a past that now represented stability and genuine, albeit provincial, wealth. She needed to know where it was, to prove that she hadn't completely obliterated her history. But the image from the ledger confirmed the truth. The ring was now in Garrett's possession, a trophy of her disloyalty. In her desperation, she began tearing through the penthouse, searching for any sign of Harrison, any note, any indication that he was fighting back. She found nothing but the cold, sterile perfection of his taste. She was completely alone, stranded in a gilded cage that was rapidly losing its gold plating. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had traded a man who loved her and possessed genuine generational wealth for a man who saw her as a disposable accessory and whose supposed fortune was now being systematically dismantled by the quiet farmer she mocked. Meanwhile, miles away from the chaos erupting in the city's high society circles, Harrison was experiencing a different kind of confinement. He was not yet in a cell, but he was isolated in a secure, undisclosed location under the watchful eyes of his own rapidly diminishing legal team and federal oversight. The Pinnacle Tower penthouse was now a crime scene. His world had been reduced to a small windowless conference room where the air crackled with stale fear and impotent rage. Harrison, usually immaculate and commanding, was disheveled. His silver hair was mussed, and the knot of his expensive silk tie was loose. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, the sound muffled by the thick carpet. "A farmer," he roared, the sound echoing off the soundproof walls. He used shell corporations and leveraged debt instruments to simulate insolvency while simultaneously transferring the equity into offshore holding companies. It's brilliant. It's utterly criminally brilliant. His lead counsel, a man named Sterling, no relation to the defunct firm, looked grave. "Harrison, the genius isn't the transfer itself. It's the timing." He declared bankruptcy, attracting your attention, knowing your predatory nature. You moved in to acquire the land and assets at a steep discount, believing he was desperate. What you didn't realize was that the capital he supposedly lost was being used to silently acquire 80% of your primary competitor, Aegis Financial, 6 months ago. Harrison stared blankly. The full scope of the trap was only now becoming terrifyingly clear. The Sterling-Thorne merger documents that the ledger revealed, Sterling continued, tapping a finger on a printed copy of the viral evidence. They weren't just proof of Vivian's infidelity. They were the key to the entire scheme. Garrett allowed you to believe you were merging with a distressed asset, Blackwood Acres, while in reality he was using the concealed Caldwell funds, now channeled through Aegis Financial, to systematically devalue Thorne Industries' stock. He didn't just take your money. He engineered a hostile takeover using your greed as the primary mechanism. Harrison leaned back, the color draining from his face. He baited me with the land, the legacy, the public appearance of a quick, easy victory. He knew I couldn't resist the scent of blood in the water. Precisely. And the photographic evidence of Vivian? That wasn't just revenge. That was the final, devastating PR blow designed to ensure maximum public scrutiny and regulatory intervention. It turned a complex financial fraud case into a salacious scandal, forcing the authorities to act immediately and decisively against you. He used her betrayal as a weapon of mass destruction against your reputation and your corporate structure. The humiliation was worse than the financial ruin. Harrison Thorne, the titan of industry, had been outmaneuvered by a man he considered dirt under his fingernails. He realized that every move he had made since meeting Vivian, every expensive gift, every public display of affection, every boastful comment about securing the Caldwell land, had been meticulously observed and catalogued by Garrett. The farmer hadn't been defeated. He had been studying the predator, learning its weaknesses and then constructing the perfect, inescapable cage. Far removed from the frenetic panic of the city, Garrett sat in the cool, controlled environment of the Davenport Trust office. The office was deliberately nondescript, lacking the opulence of the Pinnacle Tower or the rustic charm of Blackwood Acres. It was purely functional, a fortress of finance and evidence. Garrett was reviewing the final compliance reports on a large, secure monitor. He was alone, save for the hum of the servers and the occasional click of his keyboard. His intense blue eyes scanned the data, ensuring every legal loop was closed, every asset transfer fully compliant with the regulatory bodies he had quietly alerted months prior. He hadn't sought the spotlight. His victory was meant to be felt in the silence of the balance sheets, the irreversible reality of the legal documents. He had spent the last 2 years living a lie, the lie of destitution, the lie of brokenness. He had endured the pity of neighbors, the scorn of former colleagues, and the ultimate stinging rejection from the woman he had married. That pain had been converted into relentless focus. He zoomed in on a specific entry, the formal acquisition of the remaining 20% of Thorne Industries' non-liquid assets by Aegis Financial, now fully owned and controlled by the Caldwell Trust. The maneuver was complete. Thorne Industries was functionally dissolved, its valuable components absorbed. The public humiliation was the spectacle. This, the quiet surgical execution, was the true victory. Garrett allowed himself a rare, shallow breath of satisfaction. It wasn't the satisfaction of wealth, which he had never truly lacked, but the satisfaction of strategic perfection. He picked up the Caldwell family signet ring, which lay on the polished mahogany desk beside the anonymous digital ledger. It was heavy, cool to the touch. He remembered the sound of it hitting the dirt, the casual cruelty of Vivian's dismissal. That sound had been the catalyst. He thought of Vivian, trapped in the penthouse, realizing her gilded life was a mirage. He knew her well enough to understand that the loss of status would be far more agonizing than the loss of money. She valued perception above all else, and now her perception was irrevocably shattered, replaced by the viral narrative of the greedy, faithless wife who was outsmarted by the husband she deemed a failure. Garrett activated a secure communication line to his chief legal counsel, a man whose existence was known only to a select few in the financial world. "Initiate Phase 4, Garrett instructed, his voice low and steady. "The formal restructuring of Blackwood Acres. Release the funds for the immediate purchase of all outstanding local farm debt that Thorne acquired during the bankruptcy phase. I want every farmer who sold their land under duress to Harrison to have their equity returned, effective immediately, under the new Caldwell Agricultural Trust. This was the final layer of his plan, not just personal retribution, but restorative justice for the community that had also suffered under Harrison's predatory practices. It cemented his return not just as a wealthy man, but as the pillar of integrity he had always pretended to lose. "And the disposition of the Pinnacle Tower?" the counsel asked. Garrett paused, looking at the city skyline visible through the window of the Davenport Trust office. He could almost pinpoint the location of the penthouse where Vivian was currently spiraling. "The Pinnacle Tower, along with all associated assets, is to be liquidated immediately," Garrett stated. "The proceeds will be placed into a charitable foundation dedicated to agricultural education. Vivian is to be served with divorce papers and a final settlement, the precise amount stipulated in the prenuptial agreement. No more, no less. Ensure she understands that the opulence she enjoyed was never truly hers, merely a temporary lease on Harrison's diminishing assets." He hung up the line. The complexity of the operation had been staggering, requiring absolute secrecy and unwavering patience. He had lived like a ghost, observing, calculating, allowing the humiliation to fester, knowing that the greater the perceived failure, the more complete the betrayal would be, and thus the more devastating the counterstrike. The cold satisfaction persisted, but it was tinged with the weary finality of a long war won. He had proven his point, recovered his legacy, and exposed the false hearts around him. But the fertile land of Blackwood Acres, even when legally secured, still felt distant. He needed to return, not just as the victor but as the farmer, to rebuild the legacy that had been deliberately allowed to decay. He stood, gathering the signet ring and the digital ledger. He didn't need to look at the news. He could feel the shift in the world's gravity. The man who was once pitied was now feared. The woman who sought status was now a cautionary tale. Harrison, the predator, was now the prey, trapped by his own hubris. Garrett knew that Vivian would eventually try to contact him, to beg, to rationalize, perhaps even to threaten. But he had already closed that door 2 years ago, the moment she tossed the ring into the dust. He had prepared for every contingency, every emotional plea. He had replaced vulnerability with impenetrable strategy. He walked out of the Davenport Trust office, stepping back into the anonymity of the financial district. He was no longer the broken farmer, nor the silent manipulator. He was simply Garrett, restored, his pride intact, his future secured, and his past, the painful, humiliating past, now fully avenged through the cold, precise language of finance and law. The silence of his strategic victory was far louder than any public announcement could ever be. He had waited for the perfect moment to execute his final, calculated move, and the world was now reeling from the impact. The meticulously constructed ruins of the Caldwell estate were now the foundation for a new, unshakable empire. The air inside the Pinnacle Tower penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and Vivian's custom Parisian perfume. 2 years into her life with Harrison, she had perfected the art of inhabiting opulence. Every surface gleamed, reflecting the panoramic view of the city, a view she considered her hard-won prize. She stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting a diamond cuff, her platinum hair catching the afternoon sun. She was reviewing the guest list for the upcoming merger celebration, a celebration that would solidify Harrison's dominance and, more importantly to Vivian, her position as the undisputed queen of the city's social strata. She allowed herself a small, self-satisfied smile. She remembered the dust, the fading grandeur of Blackwood Acres, and the quiet, defeated look in Garrett's eyes when she left. That memory, once a source of slight guilt, now felt like a badge of courage. She had made a tough, necessary choice. She had chosen survival, security, and the kind of life Garrett, with his muddy boots and outdated sense of loyalty to the land, could never provide. He was a relic. She was a modern masterpiece. The silence of the expansive living area was abruptly shattered by the sharp click of the elevator doors and Harrison's heavy footsteps. He wasn't whistling, which was always a bad sign. Harrison usually strode into a room with the confidence of a man who owned everything in it. But today his shoulders were hunched, and his normally impeccably tailored suit looked rumpled as if he'd slept in it. "Vivian," he grunted, tossing a leather briefcase onto a pristine marble table. The sound echoed harshly. "Harrison, darling, you're late. The caterers need final confirmation on the caviar order, and I need you to review the seating chart for the foundation donors," Vivian said, maintaining a cool, controlled tone, refusing to acknowledge his foul mood. She hated when his business problems bled into their perfect domesticity. Harrison didn't move toward her. He loosened his tie, his face etched with something Vivian rarely saw, genuine fear. "Forget the seating chart. Forget the caterers. We have a problem." Vivian finally turned, her perfect composure cracking slightly. "A problem? What sort of problem? Did the yacht delivery get delayed?" "Worse. Far worse," Harrison spat, running a hand through his silver hair. "That acquisition, the competitor firm I crushed 2 years ago, Sterling Thorne, they've reappeared. Not just reappeared, they've restructured. They've absorbed 3 of our key regional suppliers in the last 48 hours, and they just initiated a massive short-sell campaign against our energy subsidiary." Vivian frowned, dismissing the jargon. "So, buy them out. You always buy them out. I can't. This isn't some regional upstart, Vivian. This is surgical. It's like they know our vulnerabilities better than our own CFO. They're moving with capital that shouldn't exist. We've traced the funding back to a series of shell corporations, all funneled through the Davenport Trust. It's impenetrable." Harrison paced the room, his agitation growing. "I've never seen anything like it. It's personal, calculated and designed to bleed us dry slowly." The mention of the Davenport Trust sent a faint, cold shiver down Vivian's spine, though she couldn't place why. She pushed the feeling away, focusing on the immediate threat to her status. "Personal? Who would have a personal vendetta against you, Harrison? You're too powerful," she scoffed. "Everyone eventually," he said darkly. "But this smells like revenge. High-stakes, meticulous revenge. They just filed a formal complaint with the SEC regarding the Blackwood Acres acquisition, the one where Garrett went under. They're claiming market manipulation, alleging that the bankruptcy was engineered to drive down the land value before I swept in." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. She took a step back, knocking a small sculpture slightly askew. "Garrett? That's impossible. He's ruined. He's living in some shack, probably drinking himself to death. He couldn't afford a lawyer, let alone a hostile takeover." "That's what I thought," Harrison roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "But the SEC complaint is detailed, Vivian. Too detailed. It references specific asset transfers, dates, and even the initial setup of the holding company that bought his debt. It suggests the financial collapse wasn't organic. It suggests he never lost the money at all." Vivian stared at him, her meticulously constructed world tilting violently. The idea was absurd, yet the terror in Harrison's eyes was real. Garrett, the quiet, reserved farmer, a master manipulator. It defied everything she knew about him. He was wounded pride, not strategic genius. "You're being paranoid, Harrison. Someone is trying to shake you down." "Garrett is irrelevant," Vivian insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. She remembered the intense blue eyes, the way he looked at her the day she left, not with anger, but with a terrifying cold emptiness. Harrison grabbed his tablet, his movements jerky. "Irrelevant? Look at this. The Sterling Thorne merger documents. They just hit the financial blogs. They're highly encrypted, but the headlines are enough. They detail the acquisition of 3 major agricultural firms 2 years ago, firms that were supposedly liquidated. And guess who was listed as the primary silent beneficiary of the initial asset transfer?" He shoved the tablet into her hands. The screen displayed a harsh black-and-white financial document, but the name at the top of the beneficiary column was unmistakable, bolded by the blog's editor for maximum impact, Garrett Hawthorne. Vivian felt a dizzying wave of nausea. She dropped the tablet, which clattered onto the thick rug, the screen facing down. The sound was muffled, but the silence that followed was deafening. "He never lost it," Vivian whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The shame, the betrayal, the humiliation she had inflicted. It was all based on a lie, a performance he had orchestrated. She hadn't left a sinking ship. She had jumped off a perfectly seaworthy vessel because she thought the captain was incompetent. Harrison, oblivious to the deeper emotional wound, was focused only on the financial carnage. He didn't lose it, Vivian. He hid it. He used the bankruptcy as a screen, and he let us, believe he was ruined so he could watch what we would do. He sold Blackwood Acres to me at a pittance, knowing the land was worthless without the water rights he secretly retained through a subsidiary. He set a trap, and we walked right into it. Harrison's voice was venomous, turning his fear into rage. And you, Vivian, you were the perfect bait. He knew you would leave. He knew you valued status over loyalty. He used your greed against me. I didn't know, she cried, finally losing her carefully curated composure. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. I thought he was weak. I thought I was securing my future. You secured nothing, Harrison shouted, stepping closer, his imposing figure radiating fury. You were the variable he controlled. He knew that if he appeared utterly ruined, you would discard him publicly, solidifying his narrative of utter failure and giving him the moral high ground for his eventual revenge. He didn't just lose a farm, he lost his wife, and he turned that loss into a weapon against me. The realization was a sharp, agonizing twist in her gut. Garrett hadn't just been humiliated, he had been testing her, and she had failed spectacularly, publicly, and irrevocably. She had traded a man who was quietly brilliant and loyal for a man who was now cornered and dangerous. What do we do? Vivian stammered, the diamonds on her wrist suddenly feeling heavy and meaningless. Harrison laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of humor. We? There is no we if I lose everything, Vivian. And thanks to your former husband, I am losing everything. This SEC complaint, the hostile takeover, it's all interconnected. And there's more. He pulled out his personal phone, navigating quickly to a secure file. My legal team just received this. It's the anonymous digital ledger. It wasn't sent to the press yet, but it will be within the hour. Harrison opened the file. It wasn't financial data. It was a timeline meticulously documented spanning the last 2 years. The ledger contained photographic evidence, time-stamped and geo-located, of every major transaction, every secret meeting, and every indiscretion. Vivian leaned in, her breath catching in her throat. The first photograph was of her 2 years prior, standing outside the Pinnacle Tower, kissing Harrison goodbye while Garrett was supposedly finalizing the bankruptcy papers. The subsequent images were worse. Intimate dinners, weekend trips, and even the moment Harrison presented her with the engagement ring, all captured from discreet, high-resolution angles. He hired someone, Vivian whispered, horrified. He watched us. He didn't hire someone, Vivian, Harrison corrected, his voice dangerously low. The metadata suggests these were taken by drone surveillance, proprietary software, and highly sophisticated digital tracking. This isn't just evidence of infidelity for a divorce proceeding. This is a comprehensive dossier designed to destroy our reputations completely. He didn't just want his money back. He wanted to ensure we were socially and professionally annihilated. Harrison pointed to the final entry in the ledger, dated just yesterday. Final transfer complete. Preparation for public release, June 2026. He waited until the very moment he had acquired enough of my assets to cripple me, and now he releases this, Harrison said, his eyes blazing with a mix of fury and self-pity. He knew the exact date of our merger celebration. He wanted the maximum audience for our downfall. Vivian felt a chilling certainty settle over her. Garrett hadn't been broken. He had been calculating. Her abandonment wasn't a tragedy to him. It was a necessary component of his grand strategy. He had used her vanity, her desire for status, and Harrison's predatory nature as levers to execute a financial maneuver so complex and patient that it bordered on genius. The silence returned, heavier this time, punctuated only by the frantic buzz of Harrison's office line ringing repeatedly, calls he was now too paralyzed to answer. "He is going to divorce me," Vivian stated flatly, the reality of her situation sinking in. Not only would she be stripped of Harrison's wealth, but the prenuptial agreement, which she had barely glanced at in her rush to secure the marriage, would leave her with a meager fraction of what she had enjoyed. She would be left with exactly what she was owed, no more, no less, precisely as Garrett had planned. "Divorce is the least of your worries," Harrison sneered, finally picking up his briefcase. "The SEC is going to be breathing down my neck. The market is collapsing. And thanks to your ex-husband's meticulous planning, the media is about to have a field day with the farmer's revenge. I need to save what little I can. And you, Vivian, you are now a liability I can no longer afford." He walked toward the elevator, his earlier fear hardening into ruthless self-preservation. "Where are you going?" Vivian demanded, scrambling after him, the panic now fully seizing her. "We are supposed to be married. We have to fight this together." Harrison stopped, his finger hovering over the elevator button. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a trophy wife, but as the source of his current ruin. "You chose money over loyalty, Vivian. You taught Garrett a valuable lesson, and now he's teaching us one," Harrison said, his voice cold and final. "You were the one who threw away the Caldwell legacy for a penthouse view. Enjoy the view while it lasts. I have lawyers to call." The elevator doors slid open. Harrison stepped inside, his back rigid. "Harrison!" Vivian screamed, rushing forward, but the doors closed smoothly, sealing her alone in the immense, silent penthouse. She stumbled back toward the window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city. The opulence that had once felt like security now felt like a gilded cage. She was trapped, exposed, and utterly alone. She picked up the tablet, staring at the name Garrett Hawthorne on the leaked financial documents. The man she had dismissed as weak had orchestrated her entire life for 2 years, moving her and Harrison like chess pieces on a board only he could see. The true, devastating climax of the middle section wasn't the financial loss. It was the realization that Garrett hadn't just recovered his wealth, he had recovered his dignity and shattered hers completely. He hadn't fought back with anger. He had fought back with patience and overwhelming strategy. Vivian sank onto a velvet chaise lounge, clutching the tablet. The anonymous digital ledger was still open, the final entry mocking her. Preparation for public release, June 2026. It was June 2026. The world was about to watch her fall. She looked down at her hand, where the massive diamond ring Harrison had given her sparkled under the recessed lighting. It felt heavy, a vulgar symbol of her catastrophic mistake. She thought of the Caldwell family signet ring, the one she had tossed into the dirt outside Blackwood Acres 2 years ago, the symbol of loyalty she had scorned. Vivian's mind raced, searching for an escape, a loophole, a way to salvage her reputation. There was only one person who knew the full scope of the trap, only one person who could possibly offer a way out, however humiliating the plea might be. She had to find Garrett. She had to beg. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts, searching for the number she hadn't used in 2 years. She found it, the old Blackwood Acres landline, but she knew he wouldn't be there. He was probably in the Davenport Trust office, watching the chaos unfold. She dialed the number anyway, a desperate, futile gesture. It rang 3 times before an automated voice answered, not Garrett's, but a corporate recording. "You have reached the offices of Hawthorne Global Holdings. We are currently unable to take your call. Hawthorne Global Holdings, not Blackwood Acres." Vivian dropped the phone. The scale of his resurgence was staggering. He hadn't just recovered. He had built an empire from the ashes of his perceived failure, using her betrayal as the very fuel for his ambition. She walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Below, the city lights twinkled, millions of people who would soon know her name, not as the accomplished wife of a tycoon, but as the greedy woman who abandoned her husband only to fall into his meticulously constructed trap. The silence of the penthouse was now a roaring vacuum, sucking away her status, her security, and her future. The consequences of her choices were no longer theoretical. They were imminent, calculated, and unavoidable. Garrett had planned for every contingency, including this exact moment of her realization. He had ensured that when the truth finally came out, she would be utterly isolated, with nowhere left to turn, facing the irreversible consequences of her greed entirely on her own. The final, devastating move was already in motion. The silence in the Pinnacle Tower penthouse was a fragile thing. easily shattered by the high-pitched, insistent ping of Harrison Thorne's personalized ringtone echoing from the master bedroom. Vivian flinched, pulling away from the cold glass. She knew that sound. It wasn't the sound of a routine business call, it was the sound of a crisis. A moment later, Harrison Thorne, 58, silver hair slightly disheveled, face slick with sweat, strode into the living area. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of arrogant composure. His expensive suit looked suddenly cheap, his tie slightly askew, and his eyes, normally calculating and cold, were wide with a panicked fury that instantly eclipsed Vivian's own rising terror. He was holding two phones, one pressed to his ear, the other vibrating incessantly in his hand. "I don't care about the market correction, Marcus. I care about the leak." Harrison roared into the phone, his voice echoing off the marble floors. He slammed the vibrating phone onto the glass coffee table, making the crystal vase jump. "Tell me the anonymous digital ledger is a hoax. Tell me it's a bot attack." Vivian froze, her breath catching in her throat. The anonymous digital ledger. The name Garrett had chosen for the file she had just been staring at. It wasn't a threat, it was already operational. Harrison looked up, his gaze snapping onto Vivian. He didn't see his fiancée. He saw a liability, a catastrophic mistake. "You," he hissed, cutting off the phone call abruptly and tossing the device onto the chaise lounge near her. "What in God's name did you do? What did your pathetic farmer husband do?" Vivian stumbled backward, the polished veneer of her control cracking completely. I don't know, Harrison. I just found out myself. The bankruptcy. It wasn't real. It was a transfer. He never lost Blackwood Acres. He transferred the equity, the collateral, everything, into a holding company called Hawthorne Global Holdings." Harrison's face went scarlet. He grabbed the remote and savagely punched the power button on the massive integrated media wall. The screen, which usually displayed abstract digital art, immediately lit up with the frantic scrolling headlines of every major financial news network. CNBC, Sterling Thorne merger halted amidst massive asset fraud claims, the Hawthorne revelation. Bloomberg, the Blackwood Acres. Hoax, how bankrupt farmer Garrett Hawthorne played the market and exposed corporate greed. Fox Business, exclusive, the anonymous digital ledger. Details, secret asset transfers, and personal betrayal. Harrison staggered back, clutching his chest as if physically struck. The room, moments before a sanctuary of untouchable wealth, became a viewing box for their public execution. Hawthorne Global Holdings, Harrison whispered, the name tasting like ash. "He acquired Sterling's biggest competitor last month. We thought it was a hostile takeover by some offshore fund. We were so focused on securing the Caldwell assets, the ones you assured me were clean collateral, that we didn't look at the buyer of the rival firm. We were too arrogant." He looked at Vivian, his eyes burning with devastating realization. "He didn't just let us take the bait, Vivian. He used the merger to mask the final transfer of his own legacy. He used you to make us complacent. The bankruptcy was the smoke, the merger was the mirror, and we walked right through the glass." Vivian felt a cold sweat break out across her back. The financial ruin was bad enough for Harrison, but Garrett, the master manipulator, never dealt only in money. He dealt in character. "The ledger," she managed, her voice a thin rasp. "It's not just financial. It has other things." Harrison didn't need to ask. His eyes were already scanning the headlines flashing across the screen. One of the networks had pulled up a blurred but unmistakable image, a screenshot from the anonymous digital ledger. It showed a time-stamped photograph of Vivian and Harrison, taken 2 years prior, embracing intimately in a secluded restaurant booth, dated exactly 3 days before Garrett's official bankruptcy declaration. The caption beneath the photo was brutal in its simplicity. "The price of loyalty, Mrs. Caldwell's choices." Harrison's fury transformed into a primal, terrifying rage. He wasn't angry about the money anymore. He was furious about the public humiliation, the implication that he was a pawn, a secondary character in a farmer's revenge plot. "You treacherous fool," Harrison roared, advancing on her. "You dragged me into this. You convinced me he was weak, a failure. You were the one who had the motive, the access. He didn't just expose the asset fraud, he exposed the affair. My reputation, Vivian, my entire life's work, reduced to a tabloid scandal because you couldn't wait 3 days for a divorce. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. Vivian cried out, not from pain, but from the shock of his violence. You were the test, Vivian. You were the key to the trap. He didn't care about the money he lost temporarily. He cared about proving your mercenary nature to the world, and you delivered. Harrison shoved her away, and she stumbled against the marble countertop. The massive diamond ring on her finger suddenly felt like a shackle, a glaring spotlight on her greed. Harrison's eyes landed on it, and a new, desperate idea seemed to ignite his panic. "That ring," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "It's collateral. Everything you own, everything you touched is tainted by this collapse. Give it to me. Now." Vivian instinctively curled her hand into a fist, protecting the symbol of the life she had just lost. "No, this is mine. You gave it to me. I gave it to a woman who was supposed to be my partner, not a Trojan horse planted by a vengeful farmer." Harrison lunged, his polished facade completely gone. He grabbed her wrist, twisting hard. Vivian screamed, a sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent penthouse. The struggle was brief and brutal. Harrison, fueled by adrenaline and the collapse of his empire, was stronger. He ripped the ring from her finger, the heavy platinum and diamond cutting into her skin before it was wrenched free. "You are nothing without the name, Vivian, and the name Sterling is now synonymous with failure and public mockery. Thanks to your poor taste in men," Harrison snarled, clutching the ring. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to regain some semblance of control, but the panic was too intense. He looked back at the media wall, where a financial analyst was solemnly declaring that the fallout from the Hawthorne revelation was expected to wipe out nearly 40% of Sterling Thorne's market value by morning. The entire structure was crumbling, not due to market forces, but due to one man's meticulous planning. "I have to get to the Davenport Trust office," Harrison muttered, already moving toward the door. "I need to find out exactly what documents he holds. He must have left a loophole, a way to negotiate." "Harrison, wait," Vivian pleaded, her voice raw. "Don't leave me here. Where am I supposed to go? What about the apartment, the accounts?" Harrison paused at the elevator entrance, turning to give her a look of utter contempt. "You go back to the dirt you crawled out of, Vivian. Blackwood Acres, perhaps. Though I doubt Garrett will be waiting with open arms. As for the accounts, they are frozen, pending the SEC investigation into the merger fraud. And this penthouse? It belongs to Sterling Thorne, which, as of this evening, is worth less than the fertile land Garrett Hawthorne strategically secured 2 years ago." The elevator doors opened, revealing the polished steel interior. Harrison stepped inside, his eyes never leaving Vivian's shattered form. "You chose material wealth over loyalty, Vivian," Harrison said, his voice cold and final. "And now you have neither. Garrett Hawthorne didn't just ruin you. He used you to ruin me. And I will never forgive you for that." The doors hissed shut, sealing Vivian alone in the opulent cage. She sank to her knees on the cold marble floor, her hand still stinging where the ring had been. The silence returned, but it was no longer a vacuum. It was the sound of her world crashing down. The media wall continued to glow, projecting her humiliation in brilliant, unforgiving detail. Vivian thought of the Caldwell family's signet ring, the simple band she had scorned and tossed into the dirt outside Blackwood Acres. It was a symbol of commitment, of legacy, of the quiet, enduring wealth she had deemed insufficient. She had traded that legacy for a massive, vulgar diamond, and now both were gone. She crawled toward the chaise lounge, picking up the discarded phone Harrison had used. She scrolled through the news feeds, the stories multiplying exponentially. The anonymous digital ledger had gone viral. Garrett hadn't just released the information to the regulators, he had ensured it was a public spectacle, guaranteeing maximum reputational damage. One article featured a quote, attributed to an anonymous source close to Hawthorne Global Holdings. "Mr. Hawthorne simply believes that character is the only asset that truly matters." He gave those closest to him the opportunity to prove theirs. They failed the test. The words were Garrett's, refined and weaponized. He hadn't sought revenge in a fit of anger. He had sought justice through meticulous, patient strategy. He had allowed her to build this life of superficial perfection, only to rip the foundations out from under her in the most public way possible. Vivian finally understood the true depth of his humiliation 2 years ago. It wasn't just the financial collapse, it was the abandonment, the swift, brutal dismissal of their history. Garrett had absorbed that pain, internalized it, and transmuted it into the engine of his resurgence. She looked around the penthouse. Every piece of art, every custom-made fixture, every panoramic view, it all screamed of the life she had bought with her betrayal. And now it was all worthless, a monument to her catastrophic miscalculation. There was no one to call. Her social circle, built entirely on Harrison's status, would be scrambling to distance themselves. Her family, who had silently judged her abandonment of Garrett, would offer no solace. She was utterly isolated, exactly as Garrett had intended. She stood up, her legs shaky, and walked to the window again. The city lights were still twinkling, but now they seemed to mock her, silent witnesses to her fall. She pressed her forehead against the glass, the cool temperature offering a momentary reprieve from the internal inferno of shame and regret. She had believed she was the clever one, the survivor. She had believed Garrett was the fool, the sentimental farmer clinging to dirt and tradition. But Garrett Hawthorne had proven that true power lay not in the visible assets, but in the invisible strategy, the unwavering patience, and the willingness to sacrifice temporary comfort for ultimate victory. She was left with nothing but the irreversible consequences of her greed, the financial ruin, the public scorn, the loss of Harrison's protection. It was all secondary to the crushing realization that she had been utterly outmaneuvered by the man she had discarded. The final devastating move was yet to come, the physical manifestation of Garrett's victory. Meanwhile, miles away, in the highly secured, unmarked building known as the Davenport Trust Office, Garrett Hawthorne, 46, intense blue eyes, impeccably tailored attire, sat alone in a minimalist office. The room was dark, save for the glow of 6 monitors displaying the real-time financial and media chaos he had unleashed. Garrett was calm, almost serene. He wasn't celebrating. He was simply concluding a long, arduous project. On his desk lay the original Sterling Thorne merger documents, now null and void, and the Caldwell family signet ring, retrieved months ago from the dirt outside Blackwood Acres by one of his operatives. He picked up the ring, turning the simple gold band over in his weathered hands. It represented the loyalty Vivian had thrown away. He placed it back down, a symbol of a past he had successfully closed the door on. A discreet chime sounded. A young, efficient assistant, Mark, entered the office. "Mr. Hawthorne, Harrison Thorne is attempting to breach the perimeter of the building. He is demanding an audience." Garrett didn't look up from the monitors, which showed Harrison's face, haggard and desperate, arguing with security in the lobby. "He is late," Garrett said, his voice level. "Did he bring the ring?" Mark glanced at the signet ring on the desk, then back at his employer. "Sir, he is holding a large diamond ring, the one he gave Mrs. Sterling." Garrett finally looked up, a flicker of something cold and absolute in his blue eyes. "Inform security that Mr. Thorne is not welcome here. This is a private financial holding office, not a venue for emotional negotiation. He has no assets here, and I have no interest in his liabilities," Garrett instructed. "Tell him that the only ring I ever valued was the one he failed to recognize." Mark nodded, understanding the finality of the statement. He turned to relay the order. "And Mark," Garrett added, stopping him, "ensure that the final segment of the anonymous digital ledger is released to the press in precisely 10 minutes. The one detailing the full acquisition of Sterling Thorne's controlling shares by Hawthorne Global Holdings, effective at midnight tonight." Mark's eyes widened slightly. The sheer scale of the financial maneuver was breathtaking. "Understood, sir. The total market collapse will be complete." "It will be complete," Garrett confirmed, leaning back in his chair. He watched Harrison Thorne's image disappear from the security feed as he was forcibly escorted from the premises. Garrett then focused on a specific monitor, displaying a live feed from a high-definition camera. It was focused on the exterior of the Pinnacle Tower penthouse. He could see the faint outline of Vivian, still standing by the window, a small, defeated figure against the vast, indifferent city. He felt no triumph, only a profound, exhausted peace. The humiliation was repaid, the trap was sprung. His legacy, Blackwood Acres, was secure, and his future was his own. He reached out and closed the anonymous digital ledger on his main screen. The truth was out. The story was finished. Garrett Hawthorne stood up, walking to the large window of the Davenport Trust office. Below him, the city hummed with the energy of his silent victory. He was no longer the broken farmer. He was the architect of a spectacular financial and personal reversal. He had tested the loyalty of his wife and his allies, and they had all failed. Now he was ready to rebuild, not from ashes, but from the solid, fertile ground of his own strategic genius. The clock on the monitor ticked toward midnight, marking the final, irreversible transfer of power and wealth. The cost of Vivian's greed had been calculated, and the payment was due. She had traded loyalty for opulence, only to find that the man she scorned had been playing a far deeper game than she could ever comprehend. This concludes the first part of the Ephim section, setting up the final scene of Vivian's absolute ruin and Garrett's quiet, complete victory. The digital clock on Garrett's monitor finally flipped to 12 a.m. June 2026. In the silent, secure confines of the Davenport Trust office, the sound was negligible, yet the financial reverberations across the metropolitan area were seismic. Hawthorne Global Holdings had officially executed the controlling share acquisition, rendering Sterling Thorne not just insolvent, but entirely subsumed. Miles away, high above the city in the sterile opulence of the Pinnacle Tower penthouse, Vivian Caldwell Sterling was still standing by the vast window, the city lights mocking her stillness. She had been waiting for Harrison for over an hour, a simmering anxiety beginning to taint the expensive champagne she had poured herself. She tried to rationalize his absence, attributing it to the complex high-stakes maneuvering that defined his world. She was Harrison Thorne's wife now, entitled to this pressure, this drama, this wealth. Her phone, resting silently on a marble counter, suddenly erupted with a series of frantic, overlapping notifications. Before she could process the sheer volume of alerts, the massive wall-mounted television screen, which had been displaying a muted finance channel, flashed violently. The calm blue graphics were replaced by urgent red overlays. A breaking news anchor, usually measured and composed, was speaking with breathless urgency. The chyron beneath his face screamed in all caps, "Sterling Thorne collapse, acquisition by unknown entity, market panic." Vivian frowned, reaching for the remote. This was unusual. Harrison had assured her everything was stable, that the merger was watertight. She turned up the volume just in time to hear the anchor deliver the fatal blow. And sources confirmed that the entity responsible for the hostile takeover and subsequent market destabilization is Hawthorne Global Holdings. A name until now completely absent from the public financial landscape, but records indicate a staggering influx of capital, tracing back to a meticulously managed long-term trust fund. Analysts are calling this the most calculated financial coup of the decade. The CEO of Hawthorne Global Holdings? None other than Garrett Hawthorne, the supposedly bankrupt farmer who vanished from the public eye 2 years ago. The glass of champagne slipped from Vivian's numb fingers, shattering against the polished marble floor. The sound was sharp, brittle, and infinitely less damaging than the words she had just heard. Garrett. The name echoed in the vast penthouse, stripped of its former association with failure and pity. It was a name now synonymous with absolute, terrifying power. She stumbled back, her mind racing, desperately trying to reconcile the image of the defeated, dirt-stained man she had scorned with the ruthless financial predator described on the screen. It couldn't be true. The Blackwood Acres estate was seized. The bank accounts were empty. She had seen the declaration of bankruptcy. Then the anonymous digital ledger flashed onto the screen, a scrolling list of highly complex financial maneuvers, asset transfers, and shell corporations. The anchor explained that the ledger, released anonymously just minutes ago, detailed how Garrett Hawthorne had not lost his fortune, but had systematically transferred it, securing it under the radar before declaring the fictitious bankruptcy. The entire collapse was a performance, a deliberate divestment designed to test loyalty and lure Harrison Thorne into a false sense of security. The ultimate humiliation was the final line displayed on the ledger, proof that the Sterling Thorne merger documents, which Harrison had bragged about, had been subtly compromised, allowing Garrett to track and ultimately acquire the controlling shares with the very capital Harrison believed was lost to creditors. Harrison hadn't just married Vivian. He had married into Garrett's trap. The penthouse door burst open with violent force. Harrison Thorne staggered in, not the commanding figure of wealth and arrogance, but a sweat-soaked, wild-eyed man whose expensive suit now looked like a shroud. "Vivian!" he roared, his voice thick with panic and disbelief. He didn't see the broken glass or the television screen. He saw only his ruined empire. "Harrison, what happened?" "The news, they're saying the truth," Harrison shrieked, tearing at his silk tie. "That bastard, that farmer, he didn't lose a thing. He played us. He used the bankruptcy as a shield, a decoy. Every asset I thought I was leveraging, every deal I made in the last 2 years was being monitored, tracked, and countered by that ghost." Harrison paced the floor, kicking the broken glass aside without noticing. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated financial terror. "The acquisition is complete. Hawthorne Global owns everything. The board is dissolving. The SEC is already circling. I am ruined, Vivian. Finished." Vivian felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones, far colder than the winter she had left Garrett in. She had traded a man she thought was a failure for a man who was now a spectacular, public catastrophe. "But the money, Harrison, your money, the offshore accounts, gone." He targeted the merger, Vivian. That was the key. He knew I was distracted, flaunting you, focused on the social victory of taking his wife and his land. He used my arrogance against me. Every penny I invested into the Sterling Thorne expansion was a penny he was waiting to claim. Harrison stopped, his eyes locking onto her with a sudden, vicious clarity. "And you," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You are the reason. You were the distraction. I brought you here, draped you in diamonds, paraded you around, and while I was busy proving I could steal a broken man's wife, that broken man was systematically dismantling my entire life." The shift in his demeanor was terrifying. The charm, the smooth veneer of wealth was completely gone, replaced by predatory rage. "You are a liability, Vivian, a symbol of my foolish, prideful mistake," Harrison snarled. He grabbed a heavy, diamond-encrusted bracelet from her wrist, tearing it off with brutal force. "This, everything you are wearing, everything you thought was yours, it's all collateral now. It belongs to the creditors, or worse, to Hawthorne Global Holdings." Vivian felt the full, crushing weight of her choices. She hadn't just abandoned a husband. She had walked directly into a meticulously constructed, 2-year-long trap. Garrett hadn't sought revenge through emotional pleas or public outcry. He had executed it with surgical, financial precision. "You have 5 minutes to gather anything personal you can carry," Harrison dictated, his voice regaining a semblance of cold authority, the authority of a man focused solely on minimizing his own damage. "The security team will escort you out. I need to contact my lawyers and try to salvage the wreckage. You are no longer welcome here. You are nothing to me." Vivian stood paralyzed, the realization of her absolute reversal chilling her to the core. She saw the truth in Harrison's eyes. She was useless to him now. She was the symbol of the very failure she had desperately tried to escape. She looked around the penthouse, the imported art, the panoramic view, the designer furniture. None of it was hers. It was all Thorne's, and now, by extension, Garrett's. She walked stiffly to the walk-in closet, pulling out a small leather overnight bag. She didn't bother with the gowns or the jewelry. She knew they were tainted, worthless. She grabbed the few items she had brought from Blackwood Acres, a simple cashmere shawl, a worn leather-bound journal. As she zipped the bag, her eyes fell upon a small velvet box on the dresser. Inside lay the Caldwell family signet ring, the one Garrett had left behind, the symbol of loyalty she had tossed aside when she left. Harrison, in a moment of condescending victory, had kept it as a trophy. Vivian picked up the ring. It felt heavy, solid, real. It was the only thing in this room that represented genuine, lasting value, and she had discarded it for fool's gold. She stared at the intricate etching, the symbol of the legacy she had scorned. Harrison, impatient, grabbed her arm. "Time's up, let's go." She didn't resist as he dragged her toward the door. As they reached the elevator, Vivian paused, looking back at the shattered champagne glass on the floor, reflecting the harsh glare of the emergency news broadcast. She took the signet ring, the physical embodiment of her betrayal, and dropped it into the broken glass. Let it remain there, a monument to the ruin she had caused and the ruin she now faced. Harrison shoved her into the elevator. The descent was swift and brutal, mirroring her fall from grace. When the doors opened in the marble lobby, 2 stern security guards were waiting. There were no chauffeurs, no waiting cars, no press to capture her glamorous exit. There was only the harsh reality of the street outside. "Your belongings will be shipped to a holding facility for legal review," one guard stated impersonally. "You are no longer authorized access to this building." Vivian stepped onto the sidewalk. The city air, once exciting and full of promise, now felt cold and indifferent. She was alone, standing on the edge of the financial district, clutching a small bag, utterly stripped of status and security. The irony was a physical ache. She had abandoned the simple life for stability, only to find herself more destitute and publicly disgraced than she could have ever imagined. Back at the Davenport Trust office, Garrett watched the live feed of Vivian's ejection from the Pinnacle Tower. It was a brief, unremarkable moment, easily missed by the throngs of people rushing through the city. She hailed a taxi, disappearing into the traffic flow, a ghost in the metropolis she had sought to conquer. Garrett felt the finality of the action. The humiliation was not just repaid, it was magnified and returned tenfold. He had sought not just to reclaim his assets, but to demonstrate the devastating cost of choosing material gain over loyalty. Mark re-entered the office, looking relieved. "The final reports are in, Mr. Hawthorne. The market stabilized shortly after the news broke, but Sterling Thorne is officially delisted. The transfer is secure. Blackwood Acres is fully protected and refinanced under Hawthorne Global. You are wealthier and more secure than you were before the bankruptcy." Garrett nodded slowly, turning away from the window. The immense weight he had carried for 2 years, the calculated performance, the feigned destitution, the constant vigilance, finally lifted. "Contact the Blackwood Acres estate manager," Garrett instructed. "Inform him that I will be arriving before sunrise. I want the house aired out and the tractor serviced. I have 2 years of planting to catch up on." "And the Davenport Trust office, sir?" Mark asked, gesturing around the sleek minimalist room that had served as the command center for the financial war. "Close it," Garrett said simply. "Liquidate the physical assets. We won't need this kind of visibility again. The game is over." Garrett walked to his desk. He picked up the Caldwell family signet ring that Mark had retrieved from Harrison Thorne's desperate attempt at a trade. He ran his thumb over the cold, familiar metal. This ring represented the legacy, the true value he had fought to protect. He slipped it onto his finger. It fit perfectly. He retrieved his simple, tailored jacket, the same one he had worn when he first declared his ruin. It was a symbol of his true self, unadorned by the trappings of excessive wealth. "Mark, you have been invaluable. Take the rest of the week off. Enjoy the silence. Thank you, sir. And congratulations. It was a masterful performance." Garrett offered a rare, slight smile, not one of triumph, but of deep, earned satisfaction. "The land is the only honest judge of character, Mark. It gives back exactly what you put into it. The city, however, rewards deception and greed. I simply used its own rules against it." Garrett left the Davenport Trust office, descending into the quiet streets of the financial district. He didn't take a luxury car. He had arranged for a simple, sturdy SUV to be waiting, one built for country roads, not city traffic. He drove himself, leaving the glittering towers of the metropolis behind. As the city lights receded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark, quiet expanse of the countryside, Garrett felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The journey was a cleansing ritual. He wasn't driving toward a new acquisition or a hostile takeover. He was driving home, back to the fertile land that defined his identity. The first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky in muted grays and soft pinks when Garrett arrived at Blackwood Acres. The familiar scent of damp earth, hay, and pine needles filled the air, a profound contrast to the sterile, recycled air of the Pinnacle Tower. The farmhouse, large and aging, stood solid and welcoming. While it had appeared neglected during the fabricated bankruptcy, the estate manager, loyal and discreet, had maintained it perfectly, knowing the truth of the trust fund that paid his salary. Garrett stepped out of the SUV. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant crow of a rooster. He walked across the expansive lawn, his boots sinking slightly into the dew-kissed grass. He was home. He walked to the edge of the cultivated fields, the fertile ground stretching out beneath the nascent sunlight. This was his true wealth, the legacy he had risked everything to protect from the avarice of others. He reached down and scooped up a handful of the rich, dark soil. It was cool, damp, and smelled of life and permanence. This was the foundation that Vivian had dismissed as worthless, trading it for the fleeting transactional glamour of Harrison Thorne. Garrett stood there for a long moment, the man who had orchestrated a financial earthquake now finding profound peace in the simplicity of the land. He had played the long game, enduring silent humiliation, to expose the mercenary nature of those closest to him. The trap was sprung, the debt was paid, and the ledger was balanced. He looked down at the Caldwell family signet ring on his finger, catching the first rays of the sun. It was a reminder not of betrayal, but of the loyalty he owed to his own name and his own legacy. Vivian had sought a life defined by consumption and status. Garrett had returned to a life defined by cultivation and substance. She was now adrift in the wreckage of a life built on lies. He was standing on the solid ground he had never truly left. Garrett Hawthorne turned toward the farmhouse, the rising sun warming his face. He was no longer the broken farmer, nor the ruthless financial manipulator. He was simply the master of Blackwood Acres, ready to start the day. The story was over. The land was secure. The consequences of greed were irreversible. He had won far more than money. He had reclaimed his integrity and his future. He walked toward the porch, the weight of the world finally lifted, ready to begin the hard, honest work of tending to the land that had always been his true, unwavering commitment. Fim. If you crave more drama and public takedowns, like and subscribe right now.